Hello, I'm Jee Geronimo, Rappler's environment editor, and welcome to Newsbreak Chats. Here on Newsbreak Chats, we talk about the stories behind our in-depth or special reports and what we've learned while doing them. Joining me today are climate and environment reporters Whitney, Bauck, and Gabrielle Domingo. Whitney is joining us all the way from New York, but she visited Manila a few months ago to report on climate solutions for Rappler and other U.S. publications. One of those stories looked at how Metro Manila's cycling boom during the pandemic is now at risk of a budget cut that could derail any progress that has been made in an active transportation. Related to this, Anne wrote a piece for Rappler on how the youth are leading the charge towards sustaining the cycling momentum. Whitney, Anne, hello. Let's get right into this. For my first question, this is for you, Whitney. Can you tell us about how you stumbled upon this story? If I remember correctly, this wasn't in your original lineup of story ideas, right?
Right. Yeah. I think once I got to Manila and was spending time on the ground, it was very clear that this is a really big movement that's happening in Manila, and there's a lot of sort of movement in that space. So I think one of the first things I did was went on an anniversary ride with Tambay Cycling Hub, which is a bike shop in Pasig City. And it was so clear from that bike ride. It was like a really rainy day, and it had been when we were worried there was going to be a storm. And there was still such amazing turnout and so many people who were showing up really passionate about being part of the cycling community. It was also partly a protest against Bauck. And so it was interesting also seeing how the cycling movement in Manila is connected to a lot of different advocacies in Manila. So I think seeing that and seeing the sort of vibrancy of that community is part of what made me want to cover it.
Mm-hmm. How did you stumble, or what drew you to this story? And I guess, what made you want to write about it in the first place?
You know, I grew up in Antipolo, and I know, like anyone who has sort of lived in that area, what the traffic is like. Even just trying to get from Antipolo into Makati or to BGC, or, you know, to sort of see friends that are more in town. And I think anyone who has tried getting around Manila knows that transit is a really big issue in Manila. You know, according to sort of more recent reports, Manila is one of the most congested, some of the worst pollution in the world, some of the worst congestion in the world in terms of traffic. And you know, as we think about our climate future and think about, you know, where sort of emissions are coming from that are contributing to climate change, transit is a really big part of that. So I think both knowing sort of the problem and then also seeing people sort of in the cycling community who are coming up with a solution in the form of decarbonizing transit by using our bodies to get around, made it seem like a really exciting combination of something that both is a really big potential for impact and also people who are sort of already pioneering solutions and what those could look like in the Filipino context.
How different was it seeing this kind of momentum or this kind of movement here in the Philippines from what you're seeing in the U.S.?
I think around the world there was a pretty big sort of build in momentum during the pandemic. So a lot of us, you know, regardless of where we live, especially if we live in big cities like New York or Manila, saw our streets without cars. Or with fewer cars than we ever had before. And that's something I've heard from friends in New York and from friends in Manila and, you know, from friends elsewhere as well, that when you suddenly see your city without cars and you can get around on a bike, suddenly it feels more possible. Mm-hmm. You know, people who hadn't really considered biking before, definitely hadn't considered it as a form of commuting or as a form of transit, we're suddenly seeing, like, actually, if I felt safe on the streets, if I felt safe biking, I would do this all the time. And that would be better for my city. That would be better for me. So it's kind of a global sort of situation. Obviously, there are different sort of specifics depending on which city you're in. But I think that, you know, Manila is really participating in a global sort of movement in participating in this and in seeing more people take to their bikes.
Let's talk about how you started working on the story. As someone who reports on climate solutions, what was your game plan when you started working on it? And can you talk us through your storytelling process?
Yeah, I think a lot of times a lot of what a reporter does is tries to find the right people to talk to. So trying to understand, like, who are the movers and shakers in this space, or who can sort of help me understand the situation, especially because I'm not part of it, right? Like, I'm not myself the person who's making the cycling movement happen. So I have to find out who is. And really this bike shop Tambay was sort of my way into that. They're a bike shop, but they're also just kind of a gathering place. You know, if you swing by any day, you'll find people getting their bikes fixed and sort of hanging out and chatting. And so the people there sort of know what's going on really well. And I would say that was a lot of my starting point for understanding like what is happening in this movement, how long has this been happening? And I think that really helped connect me to a lot of people in a lot of the different sort of advocacies or sort of interconnected communities that make up the cycling community in Manila. So for me, it was about finding the right people. And then from there, they could help me sort of piece together the story from talking to DOTR to talking to people more from the advocacy side, talking to people in local government to try to understand what is actually happening and sort of where are we headed with this.
I'll go now to Anne. The same question for you, Anne. When you were working on your story about how the young people, it's the young advocates who are really rallying on to push for this cycling, the boom of cycling here in Metro Manila. What was your storytelling process like, and how did you attack this story when you were starting to work on it?
Yeah, okay. So basically the story wasn't something that I was wanting to pursue by myself. Basically Climate Tracker approached me to write another climate story for them because I used to be one of their water nexus reporting fellows, and they were looking for more stories for one of their other fellowships as well. So I think at the top of my head I was already thinking about cycling because it was something that was actively talked about in my own university circles. I had a lot of friends who were talking about their experiences with cycling and why, and because I study in Ateneo, and why we should push for more active mobility, not just within the cities, but within our campus as well, to set us like an example. So I wanted to see. I was looking at the articles, and a lot of the articles that talked about cycling for young people were those within the context of first world countries. Like, for example, The Economist put out an article that said how young people are falling out of love with cars, basically, and that they don't see it as a status symbol anymore. And I kind of saw that being reflected in my own circles as well, in my own circles within university. But I didn't really see any reports about this kind of discourse. I only saw it on Twitter, I only saw it online, I only heard about it from my friends. So it was something I wanted to pitch to Climate Tracker, because it wasn't just about cycling, it was also about the environment as well, obviously, since it offsets a lot of carbon emissions. But I also found it as it didn't just tackle the environment, it also tackles like how we deserve more humane conditions within our cities, how it can be more inclusive. So it really tackles a lot of things. And I guess that's why I set out to it, because it covered a lot of things while still being mainly about the environment as well. And that it causes such vibrant discourse within my own circles as well.
And once you started really looking into this issue that you were seeing around you as well, within your circle, when you started working on the story, what did you set out for this story to be? Because as we all know, this has been talked about, or we have been reporting on the cycling boom in Metro Manila, the bike lanes being removed now that the cars are back on our roads. What did you want to tell with the story that you were working on?
Yeah, I think I already saw that there were a lot of reports about cycling being picked up during the lockdowns, during quarantine. So I guess a more fresher angle would be how young people were sustaining this kind of movement, because it's been 3 years since our first lockdown. So it's not really considered a lockdown story anymore. It's about how to sustain this kind of solution that was initially thought of as a temporary fix to, transport being at a standstill, transport being halted during the pandemic. So that's the kind of story I wanted to see, how young people, are usually at the forefront of change, how they were pushing this one especially, because even though it was being reflected in, first world countries, but it was also interesting how third world countries such as the Philippines, where Manila, it's one of the most congested cities in the world, how they could push for this kind of change, especially when a lot of us are still very car-centric, how we still see cars as, as the number one, as the king of the road. So, yeah.
I think a common theme in both of your stories is that there really is frustration in communities because, as you said, there's been an uptake in in using bikes, and then we have these policies that are trying to remove the bike lanes, remove the protection of our bikers, of our cyclists here in Metro Manila. What kind of frustration were you seeing I think this question is for both of you. Like, how did you, when you were talking to the people that to your interviewees, what was the sentiment? What was the common sentiment among the interviewees or the people that are involved in this advocacy? We can start with Anne.
Yeah. Okay. For some of my interviews, I guess it's important to highlight that these are young people within my own circles as well. I think a lot of their frustrations came from, actually, there's young people who are also women. So their frustrations really came from a lot of like being harassed on the road as well, feeling unsafe on the road. And that's something that I don't think should be normalized, even though it's something that we're also used to for a long time already. When they go on their bikes, they not only have to face the very harsh conditions or the very, having lacking infrastructure, they also have to face harassment, or they even have to face resentment from those in cars or other people who feel like bikes are just a burden. So there was that. But I guess before that they picked up biking, there was also a lot of frustration with like active transport in general, or not being able to get to their commitments, not being able to go to work, not being able to go to school, having to take 4 hours just to get to where they need to be. So it's a lot of things that really lead them to biking, that at the same time, while biking cuts up a lot of their time, they still face a lot of harassment. So it's a lot of frustration on top of frustration. So maybe Whitney can add to that.
Whitney?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really stuck out to me was sort of the class angle of all of this, and that there's really sort of a justice angle to biking and a sort of socioeconomic angle that is sometimes not considered. So I think for people who do drive cars in Manila, they might think this is sort of the norm, but bike owners outnumber car owners like 5-1, 6-1. I think it's 5-1 in Metro Manila. So really more people have bikes than cars. Right. And yet we sort of build our roads as though they're for cars. Like if you look at Manila streets, you would think these are for cars. These are not for bikes. And anyone who's tried riding a bike in Manila would know that as well, because it feels unsafe in so many parts of the city to try to get around on a bike. And yet that is what the majority of people living in Manila have access to. So I think it was something that came up over and over, is this clear sense that like it is this top little percent of basically the wealthiest people in the city who have access to cars. And it's a very small percent, like less than 10% of people own cars. And yet we are building the entire city around cars instead of understanding that like 90% of the city is more likely to ride a bike than a car, and yet we act like bike riders are always an afterthought. So I think bringing in that sort of class analysis and understanding, if we want justice for the average Filipino, we want sort of mobility for the average Filipino, we need to be thinking about what it takes to make active mobility more of a priority and make biking in particular something that people feel that they can do safely, and show up to a mall or show up to a store or whatever, and also have safe bike parking. It's not just about the road. It's not just about putting up a bike lane. It's about maintaining that bike lane. It's about making sure there aren't potholes so large in that bike lane that you have to swerve out of the bike lane into car traffic in order to avoid them. There's sort of a lot of levels that go into that, of making sure that people who bike in Manila are able to do so safely.
What I also took from your stories is that even though the advocates are really seeing all these challenges, they remain hopeful. And I think you've seen that in the communities that you immersed with. And actually, a recent survey showed that over a third of households in the Philippines now use bikes, so not just in Metro Manila. But both of your stories show that not only are local and national policies not enough to address this reality, but we're even seeing a backsliding in efforts. So where do we go from here, I guess, is my question for you. Whitney, you can answer this first.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of my interviewees put it really well in that story, which is that it's not that we need some crazy new policy. It's not that we need to try something that's never been tried. It's really a matter of sort of keeping up the promises that officials started making during the pandemic, and those things like the pop-up bike lanes and sort of moving in that direction, earmarking funding for active mobility in DOTR's budget and in the country's budget. Those things, we already know how to do them. Like, that's what the pandemic proved, is that this is very possible. It's just a matter of sort of holding to those things. And I think that the cycling sort of movement and community, the very outspoken people who are sort of behind this advocacy, have a sense of that. So if you want to know, like, what do we do to move forward, there are people who know and who are sort of making that clear. And it's just a matter of sort of sticking to those promises and working together between different cities. Like if Quezon City has great bike lanes, that's great. But then what if someone wants to get out of Quezon City and get to Makati or get to, wherever else they're going? There has to be a recognition that, roads are connected. So we have to find ways for sort of different LGUs to work together and work together with the federal government as well to make sure that these bike lanes are sort of complete across the whole city.
Anne?
Yeah. I guess some way that we can sustain some of the progress is something that I also tackled in my own article as well. I think in the Batalyon, one of my interviews talked about how there was a time in Ayala Avenue when they were threatening, or they wanted to remove the bike lanes. They wanted to, I guess the official term for it is degrade the bicycle lane so that it merges with the cars, basically the other vehicles. And that was something that took them aback, took everyone aback. So what Tina Batalya and some of her friends did, they basically made a coalition. They made the Make It Safer movement to protest against this, and it actually worked because they created a technical working group. They were talking to some of the officials there in Ayala Land, and eventually I think it came back. Of course, eventually they also met some pushback. There's still a lot of progress to be made, but protesting and really talking to officials and really just speaking out about these kinds of issues and just making them heard even online, I think they really help, because it really pushes other people as well to reconsider what does it mean for us to live in a city, what does it mean for us to to get to the next place, what does it mean to have sustainable transport, because I think for the longest time you've been car centric, and we think that there's no other way that we can get to different cities. We have to brave through this kind of traffic. We really have to just suffer through the really unbearable commute. That's just how life in Manila is. But seeing these people, seeing these bicycle advocates saying, no, there is hope, and then we can push back against these kinds of the degradation of bicycle infrastructure, it really just gives hope as well that, this isn't just something that we have to accept.
Right. And I think, in a way, us writing these kinds of stories and making sure that this is not just like a pandemic trend of taking up a hobby, but it's a lifestyle that more and more people can really take up, and it's really doable if more people really look into how it could be done here in Metro Manila. I think, in a way, us journalists, we're doing our part also, and that's in our personal capacity. I for one, I don't really commute, but I have been trying, and that's one of my wishes, that I can really commute, go to work or go home while cycling. So for the two of you, I guess I'm down to my second to the last question. What's your biggest takeaway from writing about sustainable transportation in the Philippines? I'd like to first hear from Anne, because since you started working on this around like April, May. So what was what did you take away from this story?
I think one of the most beautiful takeaways that from writing this story is that basically having humane cities, or basically having sustainable transport, really also gives a more humane city as well, because I think we're so used to this conception of Manila being so harsh and so hostile to us and our needs, that it's supposed to be just this concrete jungle that we're just supposed to fight through. But it's so beautiful to see how much hope it gives bicycle advocates that, no, there can be community. No, there can be better infrastructure. There can be more efficiency within the city, because at the end of the day, the city is also made by people, for people as well. So I think that's the most beautiful takeaway that I got. Yeah.
Whitney?
I think my biggest takeaway was partly about the beauty and power of organizing. Like Anne was mentioning, sort of the Make It Safer movement and how they responded to the sort of shifts in the bike lanes in Ayala Land. It was a group of people getting together, some of whom had never done anything like that before, had not been longtime bikers, had not been longtime organizers, coming together and saying, hey, this really matters to us. This really matters to the citizens of this city. Let's see what we can do about it. And they made something happen. To me, that's really powerful and sort of points to the power of people standing up and saying, actually, we don't have to just accept things being the way they are. We don't have to accept, being told, well, this is just how it is. We can actually fight back and push for the kind of city we really want to live in.
Right. And for my last question, why are stories like this important, especially since both of you write about climate solutions? Why is it important to keep telling stories like this, especially on sustainable transportation, not just in the Philippines, but around the globe? We can start with Whitney.
Well, we know that transit is a huge a huge part of what is contributing to climate change, right? And it's something that touches all of us. I mean, like the production of concrete also has an impact on climate change, but that can feel really remote and can feel like, I don't know how to impact that. But we all have to get where we're going. We all have to get to work or to school or to see family or whatever it is. And so recognizing that the ways that we all live are really interconnected with sort of our climate future, I think that's what makes sustainable transit particularly interesting to me. And I think it's partly that there's a really vibrant community sort of gathering around this around the world. It's whether it's, the cycling community in Manila or it's the, sort of public transit advocates in New York, like there's a lot of people trying to think about, hey, like what if we did reimagine what it means to live together, and how we get places, and what could that mean for our future on a warming planet. So I think it's a really beautiful space that sort of intersects with things that we all kind of have some connection to because we all have to get places, and it's a solution. There's a lot of things that we can do well to sort of fix this, and that's really exciting to see advocates around the world sort of pushing for that in their own cities and in their own countries.
Yeah, I think I resonate a lot with what Whitney said. And I think one of the reasons why these kinds of stories are very vital is because climate action isn't just about the environment. It's not just a one-dimensional thing. Now, when you cover bicycling, you're only going to talk about how it offsets a lot of carbon emissions. No, you also talk about how this makes it more inclusive for people who can't afford cars, or you also talk about, gender, like how women are experiencing harassment. So there's a lot of intersections as well when you talk about climate action, when you talk about environmental issues. And I think great climate and environmental issues also recognize that there's an intersection of a lot of things. And when you do solve these environmental issues, you also make the world or your society more habitable, basically. And you also solve a lot of other things as well. You create more humane places, you create more inclusivity. So that's the beauty of it, I guess.
Yes, I agree. And I think for both of your stories, it really put a spotlight on what communities can do. And as Whitney said earlier, we can't just rely on laws and on policies, on what the government is doing for us, but we can actually demand these things from the government, say that this is what we need and this is what we want. And these communities that you tackled, these communities that you covered in both of your stories reflect that kind of hope that we want for our communities here in the Philippines. Thank you, Whitney and Anne, for joining me today. Follow more of Rappler's environment coverage at rappler.com/environment. And you can also find this show and other investigative and in-depth reports at rappler.com/newsbreak. I'm Jee Geronimo, and this has been Newsbreak Chats.